and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today, returning with us is Nicolas Villareal, and we are going to be talking about the law of value, econophysics, crises in Marxian and heterodox economics. Why can't anyone understand what anything actually means? Which I sound like I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm really not. There's a tendency on the left that I find both refreshing and incredibly frustrating, and actually a sign of a problem. So when someone asks you, you want to go understand Marxian economics, and they go, well, go read Capital. Okay. Now, the issue with that is I actually agree, because of the state of Marxian economics, because of its, my thesis has been from my Lakatoshian assumptions about science. For those of you who know, Emmanuel Lakatosh has a kind of way out of the demarcation program, right? That the research program of Marxism, and I will also say Marxism is also a political program, which complicates this greatly, has degenerated over time for a variety of reasons, so to the point that we are contesting the definitions of basic things. And one of the primary contested definitions that we're going to talk about today is what value is, as opposed to, say, abstract labor or use value, which are separated. Not just in the classic exegesis of what it is in Capital, but what does it mean for us? And that is a central question of one branch of econophysics. It's not the only important question of econophysics. So, we'll talk about a lot of this stuff today. I would say I was surprised reading some of this econophysics work, because there have been debates around like the tendency of the rate of profits to fall and whatnot, that their statistical modeling kind of validates, even though it does not validate it the way Marx would have argued it in Capital, right? So to bring this back to my point in the beginning, if we were in a good research state, I would not be telling people to go read Capital's volume 1 through 3 and theories of theories of surplus value, volumes 1 through whatever, plus the economic and philosophical manuscripts, because we would not be having to do exegesis to justify our economic position. And I find it interesting that in some of these Marxian theories from the 80s that have seemingly been kind of lost and revitalized recently. I mean, Laws of Chaos, which I think is the primary book we're going to be talking about, it came out in 1983, and it was reprinted last year, as if like, hey guys, remember that this exists. Like, it's important. So with that long rambling preamble, and noting that, like our discussion on All Too Stare, this emerges out of me and you arguing. What do you think is the importance of understanding econophysics as stated by Farjoun and Machover, and what kind of problems do you think it fixes for someone who's interested in Marxian analysis?
Right. So I think, well, first we can kind of separate the econophysics they're talking about. It kind of got branded by Cockshot and his colleagues in retrospect as classical econophysics, because it's mostly focusing on classical political economy. The other branches of econophysics mostly focus on finance, and that's what is more popular because it makes people money. But the primary, what they were first looking at, what they wanted to figure out, was the transformation problem. They wanted to come up with a solution for that, and when they did that, they also realized that they had something which could solve a lot of other problems in economics more generally. Because what they realized was the assumption that drove Marx to write about the transformation problem was the assumption of the equalization of profit rates. And this is a fundamental aspect of like how both classical and neoclassical economists understand the basic price mechanism to work. That when you have different industries and you have like changes in prices relative to costs and stuff, what causes the supply to increase is people moving investment into those industries that have higher profit rates, which is higher prices relative to costs. And this would entail equal profit rates on the surface of it. What they realize, though, is that there's big both theoretical and mathematical problems with this. They realize that if, well, one, on a theoretical level, the price mechanism, like people don't just invest according to profitability like that. They also invest like according to the growth prospects of an industry, or an industry might cut prices and have lower profits in order to attract customers or whatever temporarily, and expect to raise them in the future. And another thing is that we expect, like, the way that this equalization has worked in the mathematics of both classical and neoclassical economics has been that it just assumes that all profit rates are equal at all times, which is a very weird assumption if you stop and think about it for a second. Because at any given moment, if this process is working out, we should assume that profit rates and investment levels and capital intensity in industries should be different. And that if we were to assume that all of the prices in an economy or all the profit rates were forced to be equal, that they would diverge if we stopped doing that. Whereas in the kind of mechanical equilibrium that is assumed by economics, it would just stay at that level.
So there's a couple of things I find interesting about that. I know that might be technical for some of the listeners here, so we're going to parse it down a little bit. Let's talk about general equilibrium modeling, because I have noticed, even in reading even somewhat conservative Keynesian economists, so we wouldn't even be in, quote, heterodox economics or political economy, that there has been increasing resistance to ever using equilibrium models, because you don't actually ever hit perfect market symmetry with perfect information and all those things. And in fact, like, it's a fallacy to assume that optimum that would exist under equilibrium only increases as you approach it, right? Like, there's actually plenty of research on that. That, again, we're not even dealing with Marxist economics. So, right. What, pulling from that, like, what, to kind of break it down even simpler, what are the econophysicists, particularly Farjoun and Machover, because that's the people we're going to really focus people on here? What are they showing about these equilibrium assumptions and assuming just standard prices of production that don't move around or have no stochasticness to them?
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, okay, so we were talking about, like, well, let's first do with equilibrium modeling and the ideal models that are normally assumed. Let's parse that first.
Yeah. So I think, like, nobody takes general equilibrium modeling seriously anymore. I think, like, the premier model, they call it dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling, which is neither dynamic, stochastic, or general. And it just, the math breaks down. Because you can have several unique, so you can have several solutions to, like, the equilibrium with the math that they have, which are not similar to each other. And in the real world, even if the like the things, even if like the prices approximate like being approximately close to equilibrium in like the basics of it does not mean that you'll be close in like the results of like the inputs versus the outputs with the kind of modeling that we have.
Okay. So to even break that even simpler, why is that important for, being able to model Marx? You and I were discussing, I think, a particular issue where these various prices of production, the assumptions of them being stable come from Ricardo, correct? Like from very early classical economics, and this attempt to fix, what Ricardo saw as a kind of like duality in value in Adam Smith. Why is that so important, and what is immediately fixed when you sort of adjust that with the statistical model that these econophysicists are using?
Well, it's important, like I mentioned, because it's fundamental to the price mechanism. And it's also why Marx takes it so seriously. What happens if you assume that equilibrium is statistical in nature, like with the math of Boltzmann and of an ideal gas? What you find is that the prediction of volume one that Marx disavows because it didn't make sense with that Ricardian assumption, that profit rates would actually correlate with the amount of variable capital, like with the labor intensity of an industry, that suddenly becomes valid. That we would see that statistical correlation. And in fact, we now have empirical studies from the US and Germany which show this correlation. And show how, in that statistical equilibrium sense, Marx's volume one theory of value holds empirically, as like the values are gravitational attractors to prices. So they're not the same, but we would expect average prices to move towards these values.
So from a Marxiological standpoint, to explain this a little bit, there's been a debate about the transformation problems, how these values transform in the prices, and there's been the multiple systems theory, which accepts that there's a hard divide. There's the value form theories. There are multiple value form theories, which they have various answers about what's going on there, and outside of like the work of Michael Heinrich, I'm very hesitant to generalize about them, because I'll be honest with you, I've been studying that going all the way back to like reading I. Rubens, and I don't really know that I totally understand it. When I actually tried to do an explainer way back on the Emancipation Network on what this, what value form meant, and I confused myself, and we all left going. So I got into single systems interpretations of value, which is value is not the same as price, but they are in a singular system relationship. Now I think the kind of meme one that you deal with, there's SSI that say Richard Wolff and Resnick accept, which is a single, where value is not price, but there's a relation. They're kind of vague on what it means, actually. And then there's this TSSI, which is the Kleiman. Kleiman's not the only person who holds the TSSI, but he's by far the one that's most mentioned by Marxists and memed out on the internet. And that's temporal single systems. And what you pointed out to me is in the temporal single systems analysis, you don't have temporal pricing of the points of production, right?
You don't have.
So like you were saying that like the prices of production in the TSSI are still fairly static, even though they're temporal, right? Like
right.
And you said that was a problem, and it's a problem that comes because Kleiman's interest is not trying to prove that Marxist theories are useful empirically, but that Marx's theory is internally consistent, which is a different issue.
Right. I think Kleiman explicitly assumes that profit rates have to equalize, and he does this because he's trying to maintain or create math that justifies Marx's solution in Capital Volume 3, which I think Ian Wright was posting a bit about that, which I thought was interesting, that even then, Kleiman, though, like through his temporalness and going back and forth between prices of production and values, kind of makes it so prices are still being explained in terms of prices, which is a problem also with like Marshallian price curves and supply and demand curves as a theory of value, because it no longer really becomes a theory of value. It's just a way of like describing prices as they are.
Yeah, sure.
And I
okay. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
No. I feel like I'm confounding you by trying to break it down super basically, but I also realize that this is a topic that's really easy to go over the heads of listeners, which is why I think, a lot of these issues get ignored, because in some ways, like for example, if we model some of these things, and I'll give you a good example that's not what we're explicitly talking about, but it's based on the same theory. There's all these debates on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I mentioned to you off air that the analytical Marxist John Romer, I think it's John Romer, yeah, John Romer, who did his disproof of the tendency of the rate of profits to fall under equilibrium conditions as a logic proof. So that there was no logical reason to assume it under equilibrium conditions given the math in Marx. This was in the 80s, and it was probably one of the big points that started causing the analytical Marxists to take on more and more marginalist assumptions, abandon any form of labor theory of value, and try to work out. I mean, I remember that Romer and Wright were basically trying to work out a exploitation theory that was not dependent on labor theory of value, which to me is like, well, I guess you're working on Marxism at that point, but it's that nullifies most of the work, and which you're pulling from. So you're kind of like saying, oh, okay, well, Marx was morally correct, but since we can't make
Sorry, I lost you there for a second. You still there, Varn?
We're having connectivity issues. Are you?
Yeah, I saw you freeze up on me, but I think it's fixed now.
Okay.
What was that last part you were saying?
Yeah, I was saying that I got derailed. Oh, I was saying that, like, for the decline of rate of profit, the fall modeling, right? So you have all this debates. You have current debates that introduced by Michael Heinrich from Germany, who's working on MAGA 2, who says that, like, if you use Marx's own assumptions about value and price, the tendency rate of profit to fall doesn't really hold, and he has some letter evidence for it.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention about that one, and I think this applies to a lot of the logical proofs about the rate of profit to fall. I don't know how it has to be a statistical law. It can't, like, the fact that
it's not a logical law. In fact, it's a tendency, right?
Right.
So like in Marx seems to know, in the way he's phrasing that so cautiously, that he needs something like more advanced probability theory to state this out. Like, and what we often miss about Marx is Marx was not good at this. He was actually terrible at this kind of high math, but he was literally trying to develop a form of something like differential calculus to figure out how to mathematize dialectics, in a material way. And he failed. Like he didn't have the math skills to do it. But so there's all these indications in the wording, I think, sometimes where Marx is hinting at, like, okay, like, I can't totally prove this. This is also an unfinished text, but this is something that seems to be true. And as a rough guide, if you look at anything that studies secular stagnation and real commodities where you don't have like IP rents or skills rents or anything like that, you do see prices declining, profitability declining, and it's like it's like you can read economist articles about this. Like, it's not even something that like standard neoclassical economics denies, as long as you're only talking about, quote, real commodities, unquote.
And like when in the 80s or 90s, when they were doing a postmortem on the crises in the 70s, I think it was either the World Bank or one of the big financial like institutions, maybe the IMF, put out a study talking about like the crisis and profitability of the time. So this is like, I mean, they don't, a lot of times, like Piketty, for example, and a lot of others will include like those rents, and especially weird things like housing, like prices and the capital gains on those kind of assets as profits included in the rate of profit, which is weird. But I think more importantly, when you're talking about the math here, there's a very interesting history, which I recommend anybody interested in read. Philip Morawski's what is it? More Heat Than Light.
Yeah.
Which talks about how economics had like on its base assumptions was built around this statistical mechanics energetics, which has the conservation of, which is very static, and is part why their models work the way that they do. The problem and there's a reason why they have to do this, though, and it's the reason why they could never get to this math. Like Marx, I mean, all the people early on, this math did exist. Maxwell, Boltzmann, like the math of an ideal gas existed very early on. No one really thought to put it to economics until Laws of Chaos came out. And people had, for a long time, mentioned in writing, in prose, all these different aspects of like weirdness that they couldn't incorporate into models. Alfred Marshall basically founded neoclassical economics, wrote how profit rates will be in part determined by capital intensity, but he had no way to express that in math. He just wrote it, and you need what statistical mechanics does is it introduces entropy, and when you introduce entropy, you run into the problem of the arrow of time. And neoclassical economics can't have that, because that implies that capitalism has a direction and that it may be unstable and collapse into something else.
I mean, yeah, it makes periodization not just a historiographic nicety, right? And I mean, this is one thing that I've had subtle debates on MMTers about, for example, where I agree with them that certain times, like, statements of modes of production are like way too monolithic, and a lot of the history of currency are just that of sloppy, but that the dynamics that separates periods are still end up being fairly clear. And I mean, even someone like Piketty, I actually used Piketty's data for this. Like, you talk about pre-capitalist dynamics, and Piketty, which again, a lot of this is speculative, based off of like, government documents and church registers and stuff like weirdly, but like it looks like the rate of growth on in most of like feudal England and continental France at the time, before the 16th century is essentially just barely over nothing. Like it's a fairly static economy. It's not and
well, I mean, if you want more concrete stats, just look at the wage graph that the Bank of England has going back to like 1100.
Right.
And it's flat. You see the impact of the Black Plague, and then it's flat until you get to industrialization.
Yeah, and even someone like Piketty will use this data, and you just look at it, and it's like, okay, so whether or not I understand all the mode of production and know it wasn't all surf based or whatever, there's still a clear, like, at this moment we now have statistical changes that we can see.
Yes,
like it changes productivity, it changes income, it changes everything. But yeah, there has been a resistance in economics to treat it as a historical discipline for a long time. I think part of that is just like, but but even, for example, if you introduce anthropic dynamics into capital, you don't always end up with like, oh, we're going to end up in communism. You could end up with something like Joseph Tanner, like complex economic societies just collapse, which they also don't want to deal with. So, or like, you have a version of like almost Henrik Grossmanite crisis theory, where there's multiple outcomes from the final crisis, but most of them are bad. Like, one of them could be communism, but there's the other statistic, like the more statistical likely ones historically are actually like social decay, societal collapse, mass death, war.
It seems like we're leaning towards those right now, which is not great.
No, it's not.
I mean, I think the problem, like why economics is like that, fundamentally it's a social science. And social sciences don't exist as sciences first. They exist as sciences second and ideological tools of the ruling class first. And I think that's a very historically grounded claim, even though I think everyone in those fields would, or in the mainstream of those fields would dispute it. But like when in a real science, what happens, and I discussed this last time we were talking about Althusser in science, people will go back and use their models on all the old questions and see if they get the same right answers. When Keynes, for example, came out with his general theory, and he called it a general theory because he thought it really was general. He talked about Malthus, for example, and how he was an early critic of Say's law and how supply equals demand, all that stuff, and gave him some credit for that. What he didn't do was include any models or any kind of math that would solve the same problems that Malthus's surplus population did. So Keynes couldn't go back and explain zero wage growth from 110 to 1870 or something,
Right. Interestingly enough, I actually have seen that math worked out by a non-Marxist, and it's not an economist. It's a it's a Leodynamics guy, who tries to come up with like how economic inputs change this. His eternal. I have major issues with what he with some of the like. Society is a battle of elites forever and eternally, and we can model that on a very simple statistics. But he does actually work out how you would deal with the changes of, he says technology, I say social relations and economics, because the tech by itself, doesn't do anything. changes all the Malthusian calculuses, and in fact, Malthus's work is actually irrelevant by the time he's articulating it, right?
Oh yeah.
But it does hold in pre-capitalist economies, like, but it's interesting that it's it's like a guy who's trying to make history more scientific, not an economist who goes back and look at what is essentially an economic question.
Yes.
And I think that's very interesting. I'd also, this is where my heart is. I've also been tired of like us pretending that we're only stuck with total indeterminacy, our total Newtonian determinacy, as via either Newton or Hegel, for how you deal with economic outcomes. Because I mean, I think, for example, when you see some of the polemical writings of like the Soviet Union and like this is the inevitable result of history, blah blah blah, people are humanities brained and go, oh, teleology, that's the problem, and postmodernism comes up. But there's also this issue where like, but you can have a deterministic dynamic without it being completely and utterly determined, right? And that's why probability exists. And a lot of times when we're talking about this from a philosophical or logical standpoint in regards to Marxism, we're pretending that entire sciences and mathematics have not been developed to handle like probability and indeterminate dynamics, or like contingent versus determinate dynamics, multiple outcomes. We reduce it to a kind of very simple freshman level, like 19th century philosophical question. And frankly, that's dumb.
Yeah.
And so econophysics for me, when you have me look at this, I'm like, oh, we're finally introducing probability into not just into economics, but into Marxian economics too, which then all of a sudden makes a lot of stuff that Marx is doing start to map out, and it makes talking about value more meaningful. And let's go back to that question, because I know we're kind of discoursing around and people may be like, what's going on? But we talk about the single system interpretations, and there's
I lost you there for a second. Could you go back a bit?
Yeah, sure. Where did you lose me?
Probability theory.
What about it?
Going back. What?
Yeah, this is gonna have to be. As producer Paul, when we release this, you're gonna have to cut out all the times where we have bad connection issues today. Sorry, producer Paul. For those of you, go ahead.
No, I think what you're talking about, like the probability theory and like the determinacy and the Hegel, all stuff, you need to read Cockshot's review of the philosophy encounter, because he does, in my opinion, one of the funniest and most interesting things, which he takes Althusser's aleatory materialism theory of history and turns it into a mathematical model of shifts in the modes of production. And it's obviously, there's some bullshit there, right?
Yeah, there's got to be bullshit there. But you got my eyes raised up. But as an intellectual exercise, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So to get back to this value, this attractor for value. So
yeah.
Econophysics is still in the single system sort of interpretation, where like the difference between value and price is noise around an individual product, right? But the level of abstraction is different. And if you model what the value should be and look at the prices on a range, price functions as an attractor. Value functions as an attractor to price because it follows the statistical curve, right? That's what's going on according to the econophysicists.
Right. So this is, I think this brings us to one of the very important parts of this, which there's a graph in Cockshot's book, Cockshot et al., Classical Econophysics. And what they do is they do something that the Farjoun and Machover also talk about. You create a distribution of the ratio between prices as expressed as prices taken as the average wage, the price divided by the average wage, and that's the representation of the price.
Mm-hmm.
And then you compare that to the labor content. And Farjoun and Machover predict that this ratio will be, in this distribution, will be a normal distribution, and it'll be centered around the mean of 2.
Mm-hmm.
And they do this based off of guessing that the ratio of like wage, the wage share of income versus capital share of income is 50-50. Turned out not to be quite that. It was like 37 or something. But you can look at the math in the book. But it shows that it is a statistical relationship, and that what empirical studies have shown it is a normal distribution.
So it's not the normal distribution they exactly thought, but it is a normal distribution that you can figure out from, just a standard statistical model.
Yes.
Okay.
And there's a second step to this, which have you read any of Ian Wright's work on superintegrated labor values?
I am aware of its existence. I will not say that I have read it. I have had him show up in my Twitter feed and yell at my Climnite friends.
Which I call him in to do several times.
I got a lot of weird back channel from both sides on that. It's and I'm like, man, no one else in Marxism cares about this, but it is actually important, right? So no, I haven't read it, but explain it to me. So assume I'm an idiot.
Yes. So his theory is taking all this. He is basically wondering, well, how do we get the mean to be 1? So that the ratio between prices and labor content is like the 1-to-1 with that distribution. And the way you do it is by he basically claims that there's a category error in Marx and Ricardo and all the classical value theorists, in that there is labor going unaccounted for when we're talking about the value of a commodity. And this is the labor that is used to reproduce the capitalist class.
Okay, so that's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So who does this labor? Is it done by the proletariat in this model, or is it done by the capitalist class itself?
It's done by the proletariat.
Okay, got it.
So this is the proletariat is producing goods for capitalist consumption and investment goods.
Mm-hmm.
And this is done concurrently with whatever production is going on. So you can use the amount of labor going towards those goods in order to calculate what the general mass of profit should be from a value standpoint, and basically take that as like the general profit rate.
Mm-hmm.
And this will get you the super integrated labor values and that 1-to-1 normal distribution. Now, it's very difficult to actually do an empirical study like that.
How would I prove that?
You would have to, like, if we had really good statistics, you could probably do it by looking at luxury and investment goods, and also like the capitalist personal consumption, and extrapolate from that. But like, we don't have those kind of statistics, so we can't really test it like we can test the regular econophysics stuff right now.
Okay.
Like you would.
It's sort of is part of that because of the way we take statistical data using other, like neoclassical assumptions are, is it similar to like when we talk about social class and we're always flipping back and forth between a Marxist and liberal definition because the only empirical data we have is from like liberal stratified theorists because they're the people who make all the Pew polls? Is it similar to that, or is it a theoretical issue?
Well, it's similar to that. I think that even if we had it theoretically clear, and that was reflected in the way we gather statistics, it would be difficult, though not impossible.
Okay.
Because, like, just the it depends a lot on the classifications, and those would probably be like slippery on that level of detail.
Yeah,
like you
so
would
that
need
Mhm.
you would need input output tables that are separated by class, basically.
So you need input output tables separated by class. Okay. So this brings us to another interesting proof I got from Farjoun and Machover that like solved a bunch of problems. So I've been talking, I do a lot of work. My day job is in education. I actually do a lot of statistical work about like how to improve literacy and curriculum design, blah blah blah. And I've been talking about, lately, like having to be nominalist in your views of class, because we talk about liberal or Weberian or whatever theories of class. These are all important, but they're sociological descriptors and they hide things. What I found fascinating in this is in econophysics, if you just look at the model that you can generate on the distribution of incomes. All right. Now we realize that class isn't based off income. I'm not arguing that. It's based on your role in production. But you had a bimodal system and you only have two. Right?
Yeah. So I think this supports. I mean, I've always cheated when it came to like the definition of class, in that I took the definition of class that Marx uses at the end of Capital Volume 3, even though he says it's wrong.
Yeah, even though it says it wrong, and then the text ends before he gives you the next.
Yeah,
like it's like the great unfinished. Like no.
But what he says is that it's determined by the laws of like the economic laws that determine your income. So if it's a different set of economic laws, like your income increases with this versus this, that's what determines class. And what we would expect, and because we get two different distributions, and there's a little bit debate about what the working class distribution is, as you sent in that paper, but they're two clearly different distributions, and
one operates off of Pareto rules, and one does not.
Yes.
So
that indicates basically that there are two different like economic laws determining that income.
Right.
Presumably, that Pareto keeps going underneath that class curve. We could see the capitalists getting very little income, but that's lost in like the fact that we only have income data for everyone.
Right. So, like, if you had two separate systems, we'd see, okay, these are the capitalists who are losing in the capitalist game, and so that also explains this whole differentiation in experience in a way, actually, because you can see this model and then go, oh, but there's also strata in both of these models. So the way people would experience class would be very, very different than the way it models out. So the bimodal distribution, which is indicative of two different rule sets and two different, explanations, and basically two different systems, also would explain why, like, as a working class person, you might have more hatred towards the labor elite because you can see that. Whereas, like, the upper end of that bimodal distribution over there in that Pareto curve, you don't even see. Like,
oh yeah, that's Jeff Bezos.
Right. Or like I always tell people from my own personal experience, like when I was, when I grew up in Central Georgia, had exposure to like, rich people who made $100K a year in the 90s, right? Like, and I thought those were rich people, and I hated them. And they were upper middle class ish people, and I was a lower middle class ish people. We were both in different strata of, some relationship to the working class or petty bourgeois, depending on who we're talking about, right? It wasn't until I got into academia and started meeting people in the Ivy League, and then really when I started teaching at international schools and started teaching like the children of a very rich elites, where I realized, like, oh, I didn't even know where the real wealth was. I didn't encounter these people. They were isolated from me, even from public view.
I mean,
and like this models that.
Yes,
like,
it does. I love the like you could it creates visualizations for so many things. And the theoretical stuff that they provide to back up that model, I think, is very, very interesting. Because in the classical econophysics, they suggest that it's a Boltzgibbs distribution, I believe. And the reason they say this is because that is the distribution of energy in an ideal gas. And it's a suggestion that like you brought up in our discussions before, that like this is like parsimony. It doesn't, it's just attaching this like distribution onto something without really theoretical explanation. The theoretical explanation is that an economy is a bunch of different actors constantly exchanging like money, and that there's assuming conservation, which isn't always a safe assumption, you will get that distribution, that Gibbs Boltz distribution, which is just showing that markets are an entropy maximizing like institution.
Okay. So let's go into this a little bit. So markets are an interesting entropy maximizing institution, like, say, as an analogy to physics, a gas is, as opposed to a solid or liquid, because of the amount of energy in the system, and there being no.
It's the like atomized nature of the actors involved, basically.
So it's kind of like a hyperheated, it's hyperheated atoms just vibrating everywhere.
Yes.
Now, the reason why, for people who don't know, when we were talking about parsimony, I complain about anybody, Marxist or otherwise, who introduce parsimony as a rule in social sciences, particularly when they're like generating, I don't know, random charts and stuff like that, where they have visualizations that aren't based on anything. And I said, parsimony only makes sense. And parsimony is the reduction to the simplest answer if you can explain, hopefully actually physically and not by analogy, because analogy is kind of weak as an explanation, but it is one. All right. So if you can't have a physical mechanism, you can't appeal to parsimony, because you don't really know what would be the simplest answer, because you don't have a physical thing to simplify down to, right? Whereas if you have something physical that you're talking about, in this case, we're talking about physical agents in a transaction, you can start to parse down what are the essential and inessential things, and then you can go to the simplest answer. But you can't just do it in a chart, because the chart needs to be parsimonious, right? My favorite examples of this is like throwing out people who like have class charts where we have 3 divisions in all the classes because of blah blah blah. Early E.O. Wright does this, and it drives me up the wall. Later E.O. Wright doesn't, and it's kind of just like a parsimony generation thing. So like everything is simple. We know it's simple, and we keep it together so that we have an elegant response. Well, complex systems aren't elegant, but if they're analogous to physical laws, they'll act more like elegant systems. So,
it's funny that neoclassical economics kind of has almost the exact opposite problem,
right?
Because they have like what's driven the big macro models. First, let's get out of the way that mainstream economics does not have a theory of value anymore. They cannot explain why a coat is worth however much of linens on a macro equilibrium level.
It basically says that Aristotle's question about exchange is stupid.
We don't care.
We don't care. Blah, blah, blah. Either marginalism of subjectivity theory. Price is either what you can get away with, and we're not going to give any mechanism for what get away with means, or it's marginal. You know,
Right.
those are the two dominant theories of neoclassical price, right? And a lot of people think they're the same. They're not actually. They're close, but they're not. And then you have some people who like price is what you can get away with, plus maybe Say's law sometimes by. And
the thing that happens when you get to the big macro models is that they have this thing called the Lucas critique, if you've heard of it, that basically says that the atomized agents of the model we have to model their rationality in such a way that it will change based off whatever policy is enacted, so that it is a general model.
Right, which leads to a lot of neoclassical rationality models or like rational agent models as being literally circular because the proof of rationality is that you acted to your wants, and the proof that you acted to your wants is that you did it.
Yeah.
So there's literally no way to act and be irrational according to these models. So it's just entirely it's a circular model. It's an entirely circular model. Now, Marxist, me and you are not the first people to realize this. I mean, like Keynesians know. I mean, even like fairly standard Keynesians know this. Like, you don't have to get to someone like Steen Keen, but that's a major problem, right? Because you just have like rational actors are rational because they act. I mean, that's literally
praxiology, but with math.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know what praxiology is, that's an Austrian economics thing where they go, economics is like physics, but not like math physics. It's like physical laws, and so we can deduce it from predicate logic, a la Aristotle. The end. And that admittedly, most Austrians don't actually believe in praxiology, but the ones who do are real fun.
Insane.
Well, what's interesting is I used to go through von Mises articles, right? Von Mises Institute articles that are based off praxeological logic, and they would come to, supposedly from iron laws of logic, they'd make arguments that were opposite each other. like you just be like,
I accidentally did a dialectics.
Yeah, and it's just like so that you like it that stuff is not hard to critique, but this econometric stuff is, because you have to know how they're figuring out what their models are and what they're bracketing out. And I remember, I think I was like 22 years old, and I was I had actually gone through my 2 or 3 economics courses in undergrad, and I got my first like real econ job. Actually, you know, my first job out of college, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. So I took a job like in accounts receivable auditing, and I needed to go and get, you know, all of this like insurance law and fiduciary training, right? And I realized, I think it was, I was sitting in one of these fiduciary law classes and realized all that economics I learned is able to make 1 or 2 assumptions for parsimony, and some of those assumptions are literally what they're trying to prove almost. And when I try to like make even business decisions off this, it don't do anything. Like that simple. Like, and I was just like, I was 22 years old, and I was like, crap. I don't understand. Like, I was good at that class in college, and I didn't become a Marxist from this realization, guys. It's not like but like, it was just realization that like these models are real sneaky. And when I actually try to apply like any kind of something else, you know, I don't use these models. You know what I use? I use statistical actuarial tables, or I use accounting logic, basic accounting logic. I don't use any of this, you know, even micro stuff, like, because there's assumptions in it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's also what makes the assumptions in like classical econophysics so elegant, is that like the reason you have to make these like all these rationality assumptions is to change how people like consume things according to like whatever change you're trying to simulate, usually policy changes. In econophysics, you can just assume that the transactions are random for the most part. They make more complex assumptions later on based off of like trial and error. But starting off, it's just, I mean, it actually, it's a brilliant way of subverting the subjective value thing, because like if people just subjectively want different things, you can't model that. Like the Austrians are right, you can't. What you can do is just like assume that because there's so many people in the world and they want all kinds of different things, it's basically just random from a modeling perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
So
what's
you
so
just
elegant.
assume a stochastic model and go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so okay. Why this is important though is if we're going to talk about communist understanding of economics and it not be solely a philosophical presumption, all right? And you and I were talking about this off air, like, yes, I do think there are certain things about being, a socialist, a communist, a Marxist, whatever, that are value normative that you have to assume, right? Like, but if we don't have elements of this that are at least approaching scientific, like we degenerate into like cargo cults really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so having like this scientific project about trying to understand, okay, what are we seeing? How can we convince people of this? Can we show them models that proves any of this? And when you talk to a lot of Marxists, they either go no or yes, but I have no idea how to do it. Have a nice day. Right? I mean, that's my experience. Like, we're not even talking about like defining what communism is or how we move to socialism. We're like basic stuff. Like, how do I prove what profit rates are in its relationship to value when I'm trying to convince people that they're being exploited? Like,
I mean, that's why I love like the work that Cockshot and Shake and all the others have done, because people will go like, oh, prove it, law of value or whatever. I was like, here, read these studies. It's real. Like there's something there that you're not getting. Now people will quibble with the methodologies and stuff, but I think that like well, there's that, and then there's the theoretical tools that it gives us. That you can start to say, you can answer a lot of these hard questions. I mean, the hardest question is probably joint production.
You want to explain what that is and why that's a problem?
No.
Fair enough. I mean, that's a problem that I've looked at, and I've literally gone, that's beyond my pay grade. I need a mathematician and somebody.
My answer is just that because it's joint production, neither one of those markets is not going to be equilibrium, so it doesn't matter.
Right. Okay. So just like it's a hard problem that's a non-question. So,
yes.
but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think the reason I love econophysics, and I mean, you bring up the normative aspect. I have my normative commitments that are outside of the communist project. I come at this. I read like Stirner and a couple other people, and the great thing about Stirner is that he makes very little, almost zero claims about the real world, although he acknowledges it exists. Yeah. Right?
There is a real world, but we don't care.
Yes. Well, because I care about the real world and I care about science and all that kind of stuff. I want to understand the world. That's the only reason that I'm here, is in Marx and all these other things. So I don't care about what Marx had to say about ethics. I think it's stupid. I think that he has something brilliant here in his critique of political economy, his critical political economy. And I think that what's so great about econophysics is that they are, by breaking through like the math of primitive energetics and stuff and going into statistical mechanics, they are actually continuing the naturalistic aspirations of political economy and its claim as a science.
Right. So what I find interesting about this is, MMTers will throw this at, I act like MMTers on my bet, nor even though like I'm totally friends with them and they're going to be on this show a lot, but but they'll talk about how neoclassical economics has like a 19th century, or even classical economics, including local Marxists in this, has like a 19th century physics boner that's broke their brain. That's the meme way to say what they're saying, that like we're based on Newtonian mechanics and blah blah blah, and you need to look more at more naturalistic models. Well, if you know anything about biological math, it's statistical. It's not, yes, you might need linear algebra, blah blah blah, but it's statistical. So for us applying this and dealing with probability and not sounding like religious nutters, our normative commitments aside, like we have to analyze something with these models in hand, and that I find econophysics interesting. Do I think it answers all the problems of how we need to do all this, what we're going to do, what the transition of socialism looks like? Absolutely not. I don't. And in fact, there are still some things that I don't think can be settled empirically. For example, whether or not there's anything like the law of value operative after you have abolished capitalism. But I also don't think we can answer that right now, because we aren't there yet, and that's not just a theoretical question. And so, I do think, yes, there is a way in which these things matter for what you think communism is, but there's also a way these things matter for just like we can prove our claims in regards to capitalism, and that's super important.
Yes.
Like when people go, start talking about, they're Marxist, but they have these new theories of class, and look at this managerial revolution. Aren't the managers really in charge? And I'm like, well, that might explain a lot of the developments in capital, but bam, I have numbers to prove that we're still on a bimodal distribution, and this is a bimodal distribution that models onto a class war, even though what you're describing could describe some of the difference in sections on both of those sides. And that's like I got a generalization that I can prove, that I can at least show this is a real thing, and it works the way it at least models the way we would predict that it would.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about nothing. Similar with value. Even if we don't know exactly why value is an attractor to price or what it ontologically is, we know how you deal with that. I can show that like there is still a relationship, and we can prove it.
Well, I guess there's two things in there. One is the reason, like Cockshot and all the others in classical econophysics, the reason that they give that this is an attractor for price is because, they go through this whole thing of analyzing like labor through statistical mechanics and entropy and all this stuff and information theory. And they basically say that because labor is a universal machine, like laboring humans are universal machines that can be used for any purpose, they're also universal inputs.
But unlike machines, you can undercut them for cost. So machines as commodities will always eventually, if you based an economy, say totally on slavery, right? It eventually becomes a no growth economy.
Yeah.
That's not even dealing with the fact that like slaves are human agents and will not do shit. But like, just even if you had total compulsion, eventually you go to no growth. It would stable out. Whereas humans, because we're machine, I'm making this point so people understand a Marxist claim. We're machines, but we can be shorted our value, and there are ways in which our labor is productive of value that isn't one-to-one because of the masking of the commodity fetish.
Yeah, unlike a machine, humans can actually, like, if you work a machine harder, you're just going to break it sooner.
Right,
if you
and
work,
it's going to be replaced at cost.
Yeah, if you work a human harder and longer, you're getting more value out of them. Like if you replace them with another human, you're just replacing it with like the same cost of a wage. So you can exploit them in a way you can't exploit machinery.
Right, or even frankly, a slave.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting. Like when he proposes a hypothetical, like what if we had androids basically that could do everything that humans could do? Then the law of value would break down. It wouldn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, if we had total automation, you don't have capitalism anymore. I've actually I've pointed that out. Like, if you had total automation, and there's a reason why, for example, from a Marxist perspective, you can have super high levels of automation because it reduces socially necessary labor time, right? Like, I remember having this argument with Steve Keen, and Steve Keen was like, "Oh, but Marxists think machines don't produce value, blah blah blah." And I'm like, they don't produce value because value is not price, but they are super useful for capitalists because they reduce socially necessary labor time. But definitionally, that's what they do. And so you can get more from people by adding machine labor. But over time, that's a problem. Unless you figure out ways to still exploit people, which is why automation never takes employment down to zero. It just takes it down really low, which does two things for capitalists. One, it makes labor supply really, abundant, so you can play people against each other and drive wages down as a price. And two, so just in a competition market. And two, like, you're decreasing socially necessary labor time, and so you can actually exploit fewer workers more. So that's why capitalists do it, because people pretend like, oh, according to Marx, no one should ever invest in anything because it's all human labor. And I'm like, no, it's really simple. Actually, it's not even that hard.
The proof that Marx gives for this claim is so beautiful in Capital Volume 1, where he says, just imagine a capitalist who's he's bought labor at its value, he's got the machines, he's got the inputs, all at their values, and he produces goods equivalent to the value to reproduce those workers. If he just does that and produces no more, he will not have a profit. You need to produce more. You have to get the workers to work longer in order to get surplus, in order to get profit.
Yeah, the people are in the chat here, and I will acknowledge some of this. They do not think exploitation is infinite, because you have to reproduce the human being, and you have that's what social reproduction is about. So people get sick, people die, blah blah blah. I mean, I know, and this is why economics is a dismal science, right? Because you have to point all this stuff out. But yeah, that is the natural limit to exploitation. But you can push people really, really hard, particularly when you add in more machinery to do so. So this is why, for example, Keynes. I always laughed about Keynes. This is a Keynes versus Marx thing, right? And we're not quite on econophysics here, but it's just one of my proofs of why this is actually one of the things that convinced me of Marxism. I read Keynes. Keynes predicts that because of automation, we'll have fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer, labor hours necessary in a day, and we will reduce work times, and people will have more and more free time. Marx predicts the opposite, off of what we're saying, because having more technology allows you to exploit more. Objectively, with more technology, my friends, what do you see? Has your workday gotten lesser? I do not think so. Not unless it's compelled by law. Literally.
It's really wonderful, the passages in Capital where he talks about how machines can make people work faster because now you're working at the pace of the machine, literally describing an Amazon warehouse is exactly what's going on, and why you see so many high injuries there. Is because when you have full exploitation, there's no holding, there's no capitalism with a human face. This is what you see. That people will work at the pace of machines and not the pace of people.
Mm-hmm. Someone said, "What if androids start developing agency? Then they're humans."
Yeah.
I mean, effectively. I mean, honestly, unless you have some kind of soul, but if androids have agency like people do, and you can exploit them the exact same as people, either the law of value is not operational or they're effectively people. And either way, you're either saying we're not in capitalism anymore, or we just have another class of human being. So it works either way. That's not a question that really messes any of this up.
Going back to what you mentioned about the law of value and whether it's trend historical or not, I do want to clarify one thing, and why some of the econophysics people think that it is trans. I mean, it basically referencing Marx's letter to is it Kugelman?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That what they're talking about, and Marx calls this the law of value, but you could arguably not call it that, because it's not talking about value necessarily. Like in capitalism, the social division of labor necessarily appears in value, in prices, exchange ratios between industries. That's what the law of value is. What he's saying, though, is that even disregarding that, in any society, the proportions of human needs and their demands, in whatever people the division of labor, what people are working on is going to be proportional to that. So if there's a big social demand for food, you're going to have a lot of people working to make food, is all that's saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you could get on Marx's case for calling that the law of value still, but what he's I think that's what Cockshot is getting. Now there's a separate argument you can make, because prices still do appear in Cockshot's imaginary utopia.
Right. This is interesting difference. For example, an early Bordigist labor tokens and Cockshot's labor tokens, because in early Bordigist labor tokens, you actually have absolute rationing. So not just as the labor. So for people who don't know, what makes labor tokens different from currency is one technical thing, and that is they're non-transferable. So you can't. They don't
accumulate.
Right. Well, and so you can't use them in the same way. So they have, in my mind, they have one limit, and that limit is they still kind of function again in a way that seems similar to what Marx critiques Lassalle on, which is the equal compensation for equal work, which Marx has a problem with.
Well,
but I'll get there.
Yeah,
And if you do some real dynamic modeling, for example, I think Cockshot actually, even with these things, reproduces some class dynamics. However, all that set aside, so that people understand the distinction here, Cockshot's inputs and outputs do not require strict rationing, right? You still basically have a lot of agency in how you spend your non-accumulatable labor tokens. You have choice, and so there is something like a price mechanism there, right? And Bordiga's labor, which I think he abandons actually, but in his early labor tokens works when he was trying to work this out, I think it was in the 30s, maybe it was earlier than that. He has labor tokens being actually specific rations. So they're rationing mechanism that's hyper specific, and there's not a whole lot of agency. It's all centrally planned by the party. So those are different deals. When I hear about other forms of this, I often don't know what they're talking about. I know I am trying to understand and work through the principles of communist production by Jean Appel and see, because it also has, similar mechanisms, even though it's councilist to some of Cockshot's stuff, but it's very different. And so I'm trying to really understand all these different answers. When you talk to a lot of like value form people, they have the intervention that communism is the abnegation of value, which is something I actually hold to too. This is also like a traditional left opposition and left composition, but they won't spell out at all what you would need to do to get there. Just that it is just what you have to negate. So, whew. So yeah, so now technically this is the part of the show where we go Q&A. But before we get there, is there anything you'd like to respond to? I feel like we've covered a lot of dense stuff in an hour that people really. I'm going to tell you, read what we're talking about and then come back. So go and read Laws of Chaos by Farjoun. I think that's how you say his name, and
Machover.
Machover, and I spelled their name in the show notes, so you can look them up, even if you can't figure out, even if my pronunciation's wrong. So that's there for you. So look up that book, and I actually, for all my disagreements with Cockshot, and I have many, I actually tell people to read his, Towards the New Socialism and the Econophysics book, because even if you disagree with them, you need to know on the grounds on which you do. So, go and read that as well. Okay. So, do you have anything else to say before we get to the Q&A part?
Yeah, I will say the one reason that the labor tokens generally differ from like what Lasalle was talking about, what Marx critiqued him for, is just that they have like taxes taken out basically, so that the consumption. I mean, you don't necessarily have to, but if you don't, you'll have like inflation in your like labor token market, in Cockshot system. But besides that, there's one thing I wanted to mention that I didn't get in, which mentioning MMT a lot. The funny thing is that classical econophysics basically does work. It explicitly incorporates the chartalist view of money, which,
or the neo-chartalist view of money.
Yeah.
And
one of the reasons I always recommend classical econophysics. I actually recommend it to my boss, and he bought a copy. Hopefully, he doesn't think I'm too much of a Marxist wacko. But when he actually reads it, the reason I recommend it, I feel like it's the most. It culminates everything you need to know about modern economics. I feel like, in one book. So I think it's very useful.
All right, so check out the classical econophysics. Unfortunately, it is expensive. Sorry, guys.
Just get it off LibGen.
I cannot tell you how to get it. And I take no responsibility for the suggestions of my audience. But yeah, get it how you can get it. Also, libraries are good. They're legal even. So let's take some questions here. I'm gonna go scroll up because there was a couple interesting ones early on. This one's related to our notions of science. Now I don't know your notion of science, and but the generation of a research program is symptomatic of neglect or later denial of the tensions in the hardcore research program. Is that a fair reading of Lacatosha? That's a fair reasoning. A part of the Lacatosha. Lacatosha actually spells out a bunch of different things that can cause a research program to degenerate. High disagreements, no predictability, so it doesn't have any, like if your theory has no use or predictability value, it'll start to degenerate. So right, like that makes sense, because then if there's nothing to test it in the world against, you can make shit up. Basically. And so that's why some of this is important. So I would say, Brian, it's one of the reasons research programs degenerate, but I don't want to say it's all the reasons research programs degenerate. Let's get another question here. We answered the one about people getting sick or having chronic health problems being factored in capital. There's a point made here. That's not the technical difference of labor tokens. The difference is they are representations of social labor in the economy where everything else is produced at their cost prices. I actually think that's a debated point, frankly.
I think that's maybe Proton's labor labor money idea.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think
I think that's what maybe a lot of people interpret Marx as being on, but the labor tokens part of Marx is like so small. It's there, it exists, but he doesn't go into it very much at all. And I think a lot of this is us trying to unpack what he could have possibly meant by it. At least that's what I think Marx is at. Not sure about Bordiga. Bordiga had no problem with total party control in a way that, like, you know, it's interesting though, because there's another thing about Bordiga that people bracket out. His total party control, and he's not pro-democracy, but he thinks the party should have factions that fight it out dialectically. So it's not there. It is not like there's one, the planning brain is the brain of like one person coming down. It's an internal dynamic. But so I don't want to misrepresent it. It's just Stalinism, and you got Stalin, like you got Bordiga from his spaghetti eating chair dictating the entire. That's not how Bordigism works. But they had no problem like having a totally planned economy to like down to everything, total abolition of family, total abolition of town and country, like absolute rationing.
Unlike most forms of Marxism, I feel like the Hayekian critique of like that if the state doesn't like you, they'll just exclude you from the system of production kind of applies to these kind of systems.
Yeah, I think it is unfair to say that Bordiga out Stalin, but if you read him in a certain, like the wrong kind of person could do something really terrible with those kind of ideas. Let me just put it that way. I want to be fair to my Bordiga fans, all two of them, but
the other thing about labor tokens though is that in Cockshot's system, like the labor cost of a good and the labor tokens are only equal in equilibrium because of like the prices are free floating basically, and their supply is adjusted by an algorithm. So they're not forced to be equal like protons are.
Right. So one of the issues now is when we talk about labor token schemas is like there's Cockshots, which is pretty popular. There are, I think there are labor tokens and principles of communist economy too. So that's labor token system. And then your other things are like regular market socialism, where there are still, there are co-op driven prices. There's a bunch of different models for that, but they're all basically they rely on recouping value through taxation and collectivizing it. And then there are Paracon councilist models, which to me, without the intervention of like supercomputers and a very robust cybernetic system, would be not very efficient and hyper fragile. So any crisis of production that was outside of the economy, like, I don't know, disease or a drought, something you can't control, would crash that model pretty quickly. And B, the whole way it does planning is weird. So,
there was something you mentioned on a different podcast a few days ago or something that caught my mind. I think the biggest problem with Cockshot is something you called methodological nationalism, which I
think is inherited from certain prior political assumptions, i.e., he is a dissident Marxist-Leninist, but he was a
Yes.
Marxist-Leninist, and by Marxist-Leninist we mean what everybody else calls Stalinist. But yeah.
Well, probably more like the post-Stalinist, like, I don't know, like Khrushchev or something. I feel like.
Yeah, well, it's weird actually. When I read his articles, there are hints that he will defend, for example, the purges as a manifestation of proletarian democracy and revenge, which that's a classic Stalinist argument. Whereas there are other elements where he's Khrushchevian, or even maybe post Marxist Leninist in some ways. So you can't just pin him as he's a classical Stalinist from from God's plan in the 30s and this, that, and the other. That's not what he's about. But there does seem to be a sense of methodological nationalism assumed in this model. So this is a way to want to run not just, it assumes nation state models, and it also actually kind of assumes autarky, which good luck.
Yeah, well, one of the big problems, and I feel like when you look at Marx's theory, it's a theory of how capital has revolutionized the whole world economy, right? And has interconnected it and made which is a part of how globalism is a part of how we have this whole social wealth now. Now, how do you as a socialist incorporate these giant multinational corporations? How do you socialize them? Because if you do it directly, if you directly nationalize them, you come into you're probably going to get cut off from these international supply chains, because the reason that these companies can do that now is because they are seen as politically neutral in a sense. They serve a higher power, which is capital. And if that's no longer the case, and we're now saying basically that these companies have an explicitly political purpose, other countries aren't going to like that.
No.
And I mean, Ian Wright's talked about, for example, this idea of venture communism, which I thought was interesting and maybe a way to get around it, but it's a big problem with Cockshot's planning model that he never really addressed, I don't think.
Well, I mean, this problem leads to other theories. Communization, for example, is basically a theory of we can't get past the national problem because we rely on political mechanisms. Our way to have communism is to destroy the national problem. We can't do that by insurrection in one country. So we prepare for the collapse. I mean, and they'll be coy about that, and some of them say that isn't what they believe. But when you pin most of them, that's their answer to the problem. It's all going to collapse either from the internal contradictions of capitalism or from ecological crisis. In which case, by the way, that's disaster communism of the utmost degree. And it'll fix this problem for us, but even theirs turns out to turn localistic. So you have affinity groups that you can communize as opposed to trying to deal with workers' issues and stuff like that. But essentially it emerges out of the question of if the national problem is this kind of a problem, how do we imagine our way out of it? And a lot of people will just imagine, and it wasn't just communizers. Even some classical Marxists imagined crisis will do it for us, which I think is insane. So,
well, my reading of Dave and Endnotes 1, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, what I took away from his essay, what was it called? What about insurrections?
When insurrections die.
Yeah, when insurrections die. My takeaway from that was that in order to have communism, you need to have simultaneous, within maybe a week, revolutions in every country, and mostly bloodlessly.
Yeah.
Or else
because terror instantiates reaction if you overuse it.
And if
So
you have actual military like discipline, you'll reproduce like the
you'll reproduce
Bolshevik.
class structures. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is insane.
Well, I mean,
Because,
it's become, yeah, I mean, well, TCs and theory communistes, because and in notes one, the debate is between Debate and theory communistes. Theory communist answer is yes, it is insane. Ecological crisis will do it for us. Like, that's the answer that they give. And I actually think, like, I actually admire like the brazen, direct articulation of Debate. Like, but you do have a real problem. I mean, and you also have a mischaracterization of why it was a problem in the history of the USSR. My friend Koba is doing an explainer videos for my friend Koba. I mean, we know each other. We've exchanged messages. I don't know that I would like. We haven't drunk together, so maybe I shouldn't call my friend. My acquaintance Koba, unpronounceable last name because it's Polish. And I are talking about the problems of the USSR, and not getting into like, was it state capital, but just like the geopolitical problems when you have both the Poland War and Germany in 1919 popping off, and then all the promises and concessions that Lenin has to deliver after adopting revolutionary defeatism. And Koba says that like you just get you get into like infinite contradictions there. So you're going to encourage nationalities to join up by giving them national autonomy, but you still have to somehow keep them into the production plan and hope that they don't generate reactions against the larger socialist state. You have to keep all these peasants that are in the majority of society in the coalition, but also like somehow collectivize them, but without alienating them or massive death, which of course that just doesn't go anywhere. And all these promises, and then when you can't deliver on that or you have to change it, it's seen as betrayal, like by the people within the polity. So you can start gaming out how this becomes a problem if you have methodological nationalist assumptions. But what I also agree is you're not going to have, because I used to think about this too, like, okay, because it's not just Duvet. I mean, there are even some Trotskyists who basically got themselves into this kind of hard. Where I mean, I think that's part of what led to Possadism in all seriousness, where you're like, well, we need worldwide revolution immediately, otherwise we're going to have capital flight reaction and this, that, and the other. Now, they didn't assume bloodlessly, but how do you do that? And eventually you get into some really crazy stuff.
global thermonuclear war.
Yeah, thermonuclear war involving dolphins. Which was not entirely a metaphor, but like, and we always bring Possadism out as like this crazy like reductio ad absurdum of what a lot of like communists who haven't thought about this stuff believe if you make them articulate it. And it kind of is true that a lot of people are just dependent on something happening that they have no means to bring about. But conversely, Adam Swarovski, I pronounce it Perowski because, again, I find Polish last names unpronounceable. Sorry, Poland. Someone's going to have to sit down and walk me through Polish phonetics because it's rough. But his Capitalism and Social Democracy book does game theory that not just social democrats, but almost any form of methodological nationalist, planning is going to get into these cul-de-sacs that will undo the goals of a socialist society. Like, so you do have to deal with that, and I think that's serious, and that's a serious limitation of Cockshot. I think Cockshot knows it's a limitation of Cockshot, but I don't know that he has an answer.
He doesn't have a way out.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, the one thing I wanted to say when you mentioned theory communista and climate change and that kind of ecological crisis, the one thing that I think about all the time, but I cannot for the life of me figure out how to address this question, because the way that I've done my thinking and it is a lot of it's traced back to the falling rate of profit and how that could force a crisis that could the kind of crisis that could actually move us beyond, that could force like expropriation on some level. But are you still there? I think you froze up. Oh, there you are.
I see you. Let's go.
Okay, so the trouble I come with is what will be the impact of climate change? Because if climate change, and there's going to be a lot of political chaos, there's going to be lots of destruction. It probably won't be like the instantaneous global crisis that like the endnotes people need. But the question is, does it destroy labor faster, or does it destroy capital faster, or does it destroy both at the same speed? Because if it destroys capital faster, it's actually terrible for like any kind of a lot of political aspirations for the working class, which at the same time made destroying labor faster. I mean, is awful, but it actually has better prospects, I think, for like some kind of socialism happening. And of course,
so let's talk about what that would like. So the one thing I can also say though, we have this doubling down on methodological nationalism. I don't really think it's cockshot. I think it's across the board right now.
Yeah,
and it's the end of neoliberal globalization has led people to focus on the nation as an answer because it's the most immediate political thing that's large enough to do something because localities can't, but still politically viable, right? And that's not just for communists or socialists or social democrats or whatever. Like, you also see this turn of thought in capitalist and post-liberal reactionaries. Like, you're seeing this across the board. But the irony of this in terms of climate change is like most of our polities are going to become a lot less stable, and there's no way they're going to stay stable. So,
the one thing about that though is that it may actually, this is terrible in quite a few ways. It may actually prevent industrialization in Africa. If like those kind of countries can't stabilize, you won't see the kind of big economic growth that China had, and we may not even see like population. What's the phrase for it when it when the birth rates change? The transition between like the different population models.
Oh, I know what you're talking about, but I don't know the word for it off the top of my head now.
Yeah, but if there isn't like that kind of destruction, it could just stop there, and that has a bunch of different implications. It could mean that there is no capital flight to the less developed world after East Asia's industrialized, maybe South Asia.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, I see what you're talking about now. So depending on how these models go, I mean, particularly if it destroys a lot. I think a lot about that right there, actually. So what do we mean here? So if it destroys a lot of labor, let's say you just have natural attrition, like we're kind of seeing it under COVID, where like we have a labor shortage all of a sudden because we've been extending labor work lives up and up and up and up. So people just don't retire, like, and now they're retiring because it's scary. So, that's a lot of some of it's like, you can't convince me that a $1,200 check, $300 a month and like a UBI payment might, it through a backdoor UBI payment through unemployment might be doing a little bit on margin. I'm not gonna say it has no effect. I know that there are liberals who are like, it's not affecting anything, and I'm like, that's not how labor markets work. But but it is making labor more scarce, and it will maybe eventually drive up some wages. Knock on wood. But it's also, I think we're going to see that problem across the board, right? And that could be good. And when we talk about destruction of labor, what we're really meaning is like, is climate change going to slow down population to the point that like there's just less and less labor and that labor capacity is destroyed, but we have all these current products. Destruction of capital is a different issue. Now, the destruction of capital could actually, actually reset capitalism like it did after World War II.
And one.
Yeah. So from a communist perspective, that's worrying. From a and that's not improbable. And from a ecological perspective, that's super worrying, because that means that we can continue to pretend that we can do this forever. I tend to not be a climate total catastrophist. What I'll say is, whatever you think about the popular reporting on climate change, what I read in the scientific literature is worse. However, we don't understand how humans are going to react in this system. And this is me just talking about my studies of history and anthropology. Humans are incredibly adaptive to a tipping point. All right. However, with societies that have crossed that tipping point, and we can't really say what that tipping point is either, you start having doubling down on maladaptive traits. That's never mattered for the history of humanity as far as we know. I mean, unless you're going so deep history, we don't know it. I mean, there's that one historical bottleneck, but we don't know anything about that or what caused it. We just know it from our genetics, right? People who don't study population genetics, at one time we were down to like 5 women, and that's why we have 5 strands of mitochondrial DNA. That implies that at one point we were at a hyperpopulation bottleneck, and thus we have genetic evidence for it. We don't know why. Like, no one knows why that happened, and that's such deep history. It's not funny. What for us, when I talk about this kind of stuff, as far as like when we model, and you get all this communist triumphalism, and in some ways, communization theory is weirdly a communist triumphalist theory. Like, it must happen. We have plenty of societies where you have humans adapt, but we also have plenty of societies where humans don't. They double down on maladaptive traits. It just never mattered for the whole species before, because we've never had a worldwide economy and thus a worldwide culture where you had a possible tipping point like that. And that's the one thing I think communists really need to keep in mind, despite all these temptations of methodological nationalism. We know that capital right now is a worldwide system. And we also know that our modern way of life is dependent on worldwide systemic trades of goods. And that actually means, from a kind of anthropological standpoint, we have something like a worldwide culture. It is because autarky is impossible now. At least at anything like a modern standard of living. I mean, I guess we could go back to, you can't even go back to, like, here's the thing. You can't even go back to like subsistence agriculture, because the amount of die-off would be so chaotic that it would probably be species killing, right? And I know I'm getting real dark here, but like, this was always my argument against primitivists too. I'm like, well, if things are that bad, we probably just don't survive. Like,
yeah.
Like,
well, I mean, our best case scenario is that like we double down on like I think that the Biden administration is actually, like, I really appreciate that they've actually going to put a bunch of money, like maybe not enough money, but a lot of money into the green technologies and force that government investment into the like rehauling the grid and stuff. We're going to need that kind of stuff on a global level. We're going to need like the new technologies to show up in the developing world, and including we need, and this is, I mean, there's lots of trade-offs here, but we're probably going to need demographic transition. That was the word to happen in Africa. We need those places to industrialize, but we also need to do it with the technologies that aren't going to destroy the world. Because if we don't, like the capitalist world system is going to sustain people, but using like the technologies and the resources that have gotten us to this point, and probably, like you mentioned, double down. And it'll especially be like, I mean, if I guess the big question is political instability, because if like climate change just causes a bunch of storms, natural disasters, people will rebuild whatever is broken, usually, unless it's super bad.
I mean, people talk about desertification being one, rising sea levels, but unless you have water world levels of rising sea level, which is impossible, by the way, there's not that much water, even if all the ice caps melt. You have there could be a reduced capitalist state that still restarts the cycle. It just will be starting from a reduced point. So like the idea that you couldn't have disaster capitalism after this, that's not that can still happen, and it's still bad. It would, in fact, it would be doubly bad because you'd be restarting on an even lower resource base, which is my assumption. Like if you had something like that. But I actually think there's going to be a lot of problems with desertification is going to be a real issue. Rising sea levels are big. They seem to have been really focused on 20 years ago more than they are now. But just what changing of currents due to like microclimates and stuff is huge. This is a scientific question. Isn't the theory that human population bottleneck was from the Tuba volcano fucking up the climate? Yes, that is the theory. It hasn't been proven though. I don't know how you'd prove it exactly. But that is I think that is the general accepted cause. But again, that's what we have for that is like statistical inference from evolutionary bottlenecks going from genetics and like projecting that back in time.
Yeah, this is actually a fun way to connect back to econophysics as a science, because you were critical of like the statistical evidence as like strong evidence or not.
No, well, I said I was critical of analogous evidence as strong evidence. But yes, go ahead.
But I like to point out that a lot of this stuff, even like I've been doing research for my new article that I'm writing. You know the picture of the black hole that we got of 2019. The way they got that, I mean, we never actually. I think we all know that they couldn't actually just point a telescope and zoom in far enough to get a picture of a black hole. They had to get all this raw data from a bunch of different telescopes all over the world, and then use algorithms to come up with, not just to get through the distortions and synchronize them. They also, because the data had to be fundamentally incomplete because of the way they're doing it, they also had to compare the possible outputs of the data to our existing simulations of black holes in order to figure out what the actual output should look like.
Yeah, so the statistical data is important. What I was saying is like, in my argument with you, is correlative evidence is not strong evidence. It is evidence. It is better to have direct causal evidence, but in a lot of these things, you can't. So the only thing you're going to have is correlative evidence. The thing is, you have to have an explanatory theory for the correlation that would explain the cause. Otherwise, you're kind of like, it's kind of like looking at statistical noise. I had a friend of mine who I'm not going to name used to do the blog Cold Dark Stars, which was a communist blog. He was a Marxist. He's kind of a post-MMTer now, but he's actually a physicist. All right, he's an astrophysicist who works in climate change, and he said he worries about some of the models that we use, particularly when you talk about like economic long cycles, like Kondratiev cycles and stuff, because some of the cycles
those are such bullshit.
Yeah, he said some of those cycles model so close to noise, like if you just look like noise waves and then like Kondratiev model waves, they're almost like they map on. And it kind of broke my heart because I wanted to believe in Kondratiev models. Like in my deep, this is my own admitting confirmation bias. I'm like, it would explain so much, but I'm like, yeah, it does look like
section in like Sheikh talking about how the Prophet falling rate of profit was the source of the long waves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, maybe there's a statistical argument you could make in there. I think that's probably you could probably incorporate Cockshot's model that he based off of Althusser's velocity encounter on changing modes of production in there somewhere.
Yeah, I'm gonna fall that under theoretically productive bullshit.
Yes.
So, which, by the way, I actually think there is something useful to theoretically productive bullshit. So, okay, I got one more question. This is from Arya Mokadam. I think I pronounced his name right. I should. I used to do a podcast with Arya, and the fact that I mispronounced his name is embarrassing. All right. We all know how conservative Biden's climate plan is. Yes, we do. At least compared to Western Europe's, which is also pretty conservative, frankly. But the meme of the 4x4 truck with the Dickinsonian smokestack bellowing black smoke from Tolkien's Mordor's is the GOP's. And that's totally true. It's one of these things where like we're stuck between shitty and suicidally shitty. I mean, they're both arguably suicidally shitty, but like one is like, I don't know, playing Russian roulette with one bullet, and one is playing Russian roulette with 8.
Well, it's funny because this actually models like our whole mini socialist problems with methodological nationalism and like whether socialism will happen or not. Because that's mostly how these debates have been going within countries. The problem, like the solution has always been like the same solution, like Piketty's solution. Like we're going to have international treaty that'll figure it out. Like Piketty wants like an international treaty on like taxes or whatever.
Right.
And presumably we could do something like some solution would be similar to solving Cockshot's mythological nationalism problem. Like we'll just do international treaties around it or something, which I find unlikely.
I don't think that way. I think you are more likely to develop a higher form of actual government than you are to just be able to mandate it by treaties and thinking people will play by the treaty rules. If you have these even communist polities competing against each other, which of course would kind of defeat the point, right? Like, but if they're competing over resources, like this is always my argument with like co-ops will fix capitalism. Well, like, but co-ops still have to operate over resource limitations in a market that makes them function like capitalists. So socialist nation states that have to operate as capitalists on a nationalist market to compete for resources still function as capitalists on the international market, even if they don't internally. Which the
funniest part about that though is that when the communist countries were doing trade with each other, they realized that they couldn't, like, any exchange ratio they could come to for the goods that they were giving to each other was be totally arbitrary. So what they always ended up doing was going with whatever the ratio was on the international capitalist markets.
Yeah.
And there's some comment that of some official or whatever that after full communism, we're going to have to keep one country capitalist, so we'll know how to set the exchange ratios of trade between countries.
Oh, God. Shake has a graph showing K-waves using gold prices that match the data. When we say, guys, the thing is, you have to explain not that the data is there, but that the data is not statistical noise, that it's not just a wave. So, like, is the correlative evidence strong enough? It might be. Shake is fascinating to me, and I think Shake is one of the more interesting people, but he's also, over time, been all over the place on certain questions. So, which I both admire but find frustrating, because when someone asks me, like, what does Shake think? I'm like, well, are we talking about 1980 Shake or like Shake last year? Because those are different. But anyway, I think I want to believe in contrarians. I'm not saying they're BS, but like when we say that they're statistically close to noise, just look at how a noise wave models and look if it's very close. If that wave is that close, it means it's not a strong predictive evidence, like mathematically speaking. Okay, so I'm gonna take a break. I think I might have been given an invite to go talk to show them an argument about Israel Palestine, and I'm going to make an announcement about plans on this channel later on tonight. I would like to thank Nico for being my regular bet nor of someone who is very close to me, but is still a dirty Althusserian and can't be trusted, and might believe in the eternal. What are your critiques of Ray? I'm reading his Capitalism Contradictions book. I'm wondering it's worth it for its length. I don't like. It depends on when you're talking about. I mean that literally. It depends on when you're talking about Shake. I've gone through that book before, and I'd have to like really go back and approach it. My biggest one is like he wasn't a Conrad waves. Is that he seemed really bullish on the statistical data that seemed real, but not. It could be explained other ways. Who are you bringing for the panel? I've asked 5 different specialists so far. One has declined just because they're too busy, and I haven't heard back yet. Until I hear back, the only one I'll say for sure is Gene Badgelon because he's already agreed to it. Finkelstein is an interesting scholar on that. I am of two minds about that, not because of his, lack of leftism, but because of some things he said in other cases and some places he's taken money from. But I know he does. I love his early scholarship on both Israel Palestine and on the abuse of the legacy of the Holocaust. So I think he's a super important dude. So I could invite him, but he's also. I also think maybe a lot of you need to hear from people who aren't left celebrities. So I invited Palestinian scholars for the most part, and Egyptian scholars, and an Israeli scholar who's an anti-Zionist. So, but I'm not gonna say who they are because they haven't agreed to come on yet. All right.
One thing about the contra, whatever they're called, the cycles. The reason you know that they're bullshit is because the number one place people apply them is stock market data. So keep that in mind.
Yeah. I would say he took money from Untz, guy who has funded a bunch of left-wing anti-Zionist work, but also he's funded white supremacists. Untz has, that's UNZ, and it's actually an undeniable fact. I personally think Finkelstein did it out of desperation because of the blacklist he had in academia, but that doesn't change the fact that that's where the money came from. So that's what it is. And does that discredit everything he says? No, but and I agree with some of what Finkelstein says, but he's also made some generalizations recently that about like just talking about Jews as a whole that that I don't think you can make about any ethnicity. So yeah. I don't want to go much more into that. That's just all matter of public record, and it's, to me, it's actually a shame because Finkelstein was a hero to me as a person with some Jewish ethnic background who has never supported Zionism, and I found his early scholarship super important, and so the recent turn there has been somewhat sad. Do I think that everybody should cancel him? No, I don't. In fact, I'm a little upset that the left did not support him more before it got to that point. But here we are.
One thing, maybe you should look more into Moshe Machover. Like both of those people who wrote Laws of Chaos were Israeli members of the Communist Party, militant anti-Zionists. Moshe Machover actually got kicked out of the Labor Party recently because of the anti-Semitism purges.
Machover did? Wow.
Yes. He's still alive.
Yeah. Okay. So now that this has led to a total debate in my stream that is going to get nasty, I'm going to end the stream here. So thank you, Nico, for coming on. And later tonight, I will probably be back on to make a few announcements and do a little monologue for you guys. And tell you the upcoming developments just on stuff coming up with producer Paul and what we're going to be doing with the podcast, which will have an audio form. And it will have a Patreon, and they'll have additional episodes, etc., and so forth. All right. Bye-bye.